Okay, here we go. Okay, so again, welcome everyone. This is the opening session of Styles and Method in the Early Modern and the Modern Period. My name is Matteo Vagelli, and I am a Marie Curie postdoctoral fellow in philosophy of science at the Department of Philosophy and Cultural Heritage at the University of Ca' Foscari, Venice. This seminar is part of the activities of EpiStyle, a project which has received funding from the European Union's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Program under the Marie Sklodowska-Curie Grant Agreement number 1010-3646. Please visit this website. I am writing in the chat box, which is the website of the project, for more information and for the complete program of this seminar. Abstracts, for example, can be found on the website. Again, I should remind you that this meeting will be recorded, so by participating, you give your consent. The idea behind the seminar is that a distinctive link between style and ways of thinking was formed between the early modern and the modern periods. One that not only played a specific role in the emergence of philology as a model for knowledge, but also in discussions of scientific method. And I am particularly delighted to be able to discuss these matters today with Carlotta Santini, whom I wish to thank for having accepted my invitation. Santini has held several research positions at some of the most prestigious institutions from all over the world, including Princeton, the Warburg Institute, Cambridge, and the University of Copenhagen. And she is now chargée de recherche de classe normale at the CNRS and at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. Santini's research interests include German philosophy and aesthetics, German culture between the 18th and the 20th century, and Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy. Among her latest publications, there are the translation, the edition and introduction of Nietzsche's Les Cas Homères for les éditions de l'EHSS, which came out in 2017, and Nietzsche on Memory and History, the Re-Encountered Shadow, published by De Gruyter last year, 2021. Today, she presents a talk titled Reading Well, Writing Well, Living Well, Friedrich Nietzsche and the Question of Style. The talk will be about 40 to 50 minutes. Then we shall have time for an open discussion. So without further ado, Carlotta, please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Matteo. Thank you to all of you for being here. I'm honored to open this discussion with you on style. Let me start. My proposal, so the title was very, very ambitious. I would have needed 3 times the time I have, so probably you will be a little bit upset of what I'm telling to you today, but let's start. The reflection on style in Nietzsche's philosophical work is a classic topos of scholarship on this author. From a purely literary point of view, Nietzsche can indeed be considered one of the most revolutionary authors of the German landscape of his time, and certainly a milestone in the history of German literature. Far removed from the conventional scholastic language of the classical German philosophical tradition, his use of language, but also and above all of literary genres and forms, distinguishes him from the erudite and often hermetic practices from the systematic language of the academic circles of his time. There are many scholars, both in the field of Germanistic and philosophy, who have attempted to account for the specificity of Nietzsche's language, and above all of his continuous stylistic research that led him to experiment with new genres and new forms of expression. Today, with you, I will not attempt to provide a stylistic analysis of Nietzsche's writing, a task I will gladly leave to those who have a more solid critical skills than I have. I also believe that the question of style can and should be addressed in Nietzsche's work in three distinct, though often interdependent ways. On the one hand, we have Nietzsche's literary and philosophical style, a style that is sought after rather than refined or researched, and honed in many literary experiments. A style whose research is undoubtedly largely conscious and meditated upon, and whose results are before the eyes of all readers. On the other hand, we have a reflection on style, which certainly has the characteristic of an aesthetic reflection, but also and above all of a critical and methodological reflection. Then there is a third dimension, which we might call operational, if you want, of stylistic reflection. One could almost speak for a good part of Nietzsche's philosophy of an attempt to delineate a stylistic as a normative discipline of thought and human action. By this term, we do not mean here only Nietzsche's use of the category of style as a descriptive tool, as a model, similar in many ways to that of type, already used in the natural sciences and taken up by Burckhardt. So a model for a taxonomy of the culture and society of his time. We have also this aspect in the reflection on style. But the reflection on style, on the genesis of styles, on the necessity of the search for and the acquisition of a style, as much in writing as in thinking and even in acting, and in the complex articulations of existence, what we might call custom or above all Weltanschauung, becomes for Nietzsche the opportunity to confer on his philosophical reflection a productive and operative dimension. Rather than asking what Nietzsche's particular style consists of, it is worth asking what style is for Nietzsche, style as such, and why the search for a style, any style, can come to overlap with a rigorous philosophical practice. The question of style in Nietzsche's work cuts across the spheres of aesthetics, cultural criticism, and even the domain of practice, developing almost synesthetically between music, metrics, literature, involving physiology, epistemology, the study of customs and Weltanschauung, and even food. The construction of a style as a rigorous discipline, which takes time and involves every external and internal manifestation of the person, is perhaps the only concrete example that Nietzsche gives us in an unequivocal way of how his philosophy should operate in the perspective of a general transformation, of a transvaluation of the human type. I will only be able to deal with the premises, so also with the surface of this question with you today, by presenting what can be called a sort of prolegomena, propedeutic reflection on the need for an active stylistic research in Nietzsche's work. So let's start with the prejudice against writing. The emergence of the question of style in Nietzsche's reflection since the Basel years is inextricably linked to the discussion of the cultural historical role of writing, and in particular of philosophical writing. Previous reflection on the oral and performative dimension of language and poetry in the Greek world certainly constituted a fertile ground for establishing the basis of the discourse on style. I will limit myself here only to a very, very specific observation. Nietzsche begins to speak of style from the very moment he addresses literary prose, first and foremost that of the rhetorical tradition, but even more that of the ancient philosophical tradition. In the context most appropriately characterized by orality, in the case, for example, of lyric poetry, epos and elegy, the term ethos is most frequently used, which in many ways overlaps with the broader conception of style we encounter in Nietzsche's major work. By ethos is meant, ethos could be translated as character, has been translated as character. By ethos is meant the specific character of a composition resulting from a wise union of rhythms and tones, from a particular linguistic choices, and even from a choice of contents, the poetical objects of the composition. The ethos of a work of art is thus an intrinsic, albeit acquired, characteristic of the composition itself, but it also defines the intentionality of the composer and the type of receptivity of the audience. This notion of ethos, thanks also to the mediation of the classical rhetoric, where this notion was precisely understood as a general disposition of both the speaker and the spectator, is in my opinion decisive for assessing the genesis and foundation of the Nietzschean notion of style. Now, the more the Greek culture distances itself from the purely oral dimension of its original development, the more prose imposes itself as a literary model, the more the question of style becomes prominent. The progressive recourse to writing in the context of schools of rhetoric and philosophical academies in order to convey prose text of a certain size or speeches was argument needed to be reported as precisely as possible, is extensively studied by Nietzsche in his lectures on the history of Greek literature. Nietzsche's attitude toward writing, and in particular towards philosophical writing, does not differ so much from Plato's own attitude. Although convinced of the legitimacy of the Socratic diktat, which as a matter of principle refuses writing the right of citizenship in the performance of authentic philosophical activity, Nietzsche, like Plato, will become a writer philosopher. And what for a writer, we could add. Nietzsche fully shares the argument and the attitude of distrust toward writing that was typical of the philosopher of antiquity, and which is masterfully reported in the myth of Thoth from Plato's Phaedrus. I quote, "Writing weakens the memory, numbs the reactivity of the spirit, it induces the entirely illusory impression of being in possession of a great wisdom, of a knowledge." Translated into the language of his century, at the apex of a literary civilization, the Socratic diktat is necessarily transformed into a polemic against writing books. Nietzsche's time had already witnessed the explosion of the vast book and publishing industry, not only in the field of belletristic, but also in the field of scientific literature. While the young Nietzsche of the 60s could still look forward to the prospect of one day owning a library of fundamental texts and cautiously limited his book purchases, books were very, very expensive at that time, the Nietzsche of the 80s was an avid user of the vast and varied book market, not only in Germany, but also internationally. The most immediate negative consequence of this extraordinary season of publishing is the inevitable devaluation of the object book and of the knowledge it contains. If one writes a lot and quickly and reads as much, if the book costs little, both in terms of effort and economic cost, the consequence is a general loss of attention by the public and a loss of value of the book itself. One should recall the drakonisches Gesetz gegen Schriftsteller, the draconian law against writer that Nietzsche issued in aphorism 193 of Menschliches also Menschliches. Writers ought to be treated as malefactors who deserve to be freed or pardoned only in the rarest cases. This would be a way of preventing the proliferation of books. End quotation. Nietzsche particularly insists on renitence, on the reluctance that becomes reticence, on shame in the face of writing. In aphorism 192 of Human All to Human, the best author is described as he who is ashamed to become a writer. This is evidently a reformulation of the famous passage in the Phaedrus, where Plato tells of how free citizens and politicians were ashamed of leaving writings, being worried to be confused after their death with sophists. But there is something more here. Shame is a central feeling in Nietzsche's work. We find it thematized in a series of aphorisms in the first part of Human All to Human, in particular aphorism 100, where shame is presented as the indicator of the proximity of something sacred and mysterious. For Nietzsche, shame is a mixture of reverential awe and embarrassment, the same feeling one has towards sex, for example, and the mysteries of birth. It generates that hesitation between attraction and panic, between reverence and reserve that one feels in the presence of a sovereign or when one enters the innermost part of a temple. In a similar way, Leontius in Plato's Republic feels both repelled and attracted by the scabrous spectacle of a corpse, of a dead body, but his shame was not a sufficient deterrent to prevent him from satisfying his morbid curiosity. Nietzschean shame, der Scham, is a far more interesting instrument of moderation. It is certainly a deterrent instrument, but not necessarily one of censorship. Shame means hesitation, continence, and moderation when faced with something powerful and potentially dangerous. The perspective to which the effect of this emotion leads is twofold, both that of preserving the sacred qualities of the object of shame and that of safeguarding the integrity of the subject who approaches this object unwisely. As the poetic word in antiquity was recognized having an almost magical power, and as Nietzsche tells us in the lecture on Greek history of literature, but also in the Guy Science, so writing in the modern world has become a powerful tool. The pen is a weapon, as many famous adagia recite, but it is a double-edged sword. It hurts not only the reader, but also the writer, who too quickly lies bare his inner self in his writing. We must therefore be shy of writing in order to preserve this power, in order not to debase, to devaluate, to diminish it with our incontinence. The philosopher, more than anyone else, should shy away from this practice. To remain on the topic of legitimate prudery, the philosopher is not suited to exhibitionism, and since his thought is precious and intimate, he does not need the world to watch him. A good philosopher will therefore be the most discreet and asperest writer, as Nietzsche says in Beyond Good and Evil 39. Nietzsche's arguments against writing go beyond the traditional Platonic ones. Writing is a poorer means of communication than speech, according to Nietzsche, and while it apparently avoids ambiguity, what is written and should be understood unambiguously, in fact, it always produces new ambiguities, precisely because it reduces the message to a fixed form that does not account for all the nuance of oral expression. If for Nietzsche, as for Dante in the Paradiso, the word is unable to fully express thought, the written word stands at an even lower level of simplification. Writing crystallizes thought, Särgen und Leichentürke, coffins and shrouds of thought, Nietzsche would call the books in a poetic sketch of the Guy Science. Whereas thought is instead dynamic, Plato would have said dialectical. To consigning one's own thought to a rigid and finished form, thus consigning it to writing, means entrusting it to the reader's poor judgment and approximate understanding, without any possibility of future mediation, of a future clarifying debate with the author. And still we write. Writing is today, perhaps more than in the 19th century, increasingly the medium through which art, science, politics, feelings, and opinions are manifested, communicated, and disseminated. Whoever writes wants above all to communicate, and to communicate with as many people as possible. Writing means, first of all, wanting to make public what one has written, in spite of those who claim to write for themselves. Here, according to Nietzsche, lies the shamelessness of the modern writer, the belief that what one has to say is of fundamental importance and must absolutely be communicated. But here also lies the naivete and foolish lightness with which we are used to communicating what is most intimate and precious to us, our thoughts, laying them bare in front of strangers, far away from us and our experience, strangers who might not understand them, our thoughts, and who can do what they want with them. No self-respecting thinker would wish to take such a risk for his work, so Nietzsche. And yet it's precisely on the razor's edge of this imperfect, shameless, and risky communication that the fate of a work, and with it of its thinker, it is at stake. It was precisely by playing on this dangerous ridge that that wise opportunist, or rather that divine writer, of whom Nietzsche speaks in aphorism 121 of Beyond Good and Evil, learned Greek and bad enough so as to gain more readers, whatever their background and education was. I quote this aphorism: "It is subtle that God learned Greek when he wanted to become a writer, and that he did not learn it better." Of course, in this case, too, one has to wonder whether the divine message of God was really understood by the readers of the Gospels. "Aber warum schreibst denn du?" But why do you write? This is the question Nietzsche addresses in The Guy Science 93. And Nietzsche addresses to himself what he had called in the lecture on the history of Greek literature the cardinal frage, the cardinal question of the Platonic Phaedrus. Why does a philosopher like Nietzsche resolve to write and communicate his thoughts? Nietzsche often talks about his choice to write malgré lui. One could say, not to spare him a criticism, that he is anything but reticent when it comes to speaking about his reticence in writing. His reticence toward the degradation of thought by means of communication is still the basis for the formulation in The Twilight of the Idols 26 of a morality for deaf and dumb and other philosophers. For not only those who have nothing to say would do better to keep silent, but especially those who are much to say and something important to say demand silence. The weight of thoughts is too great to be borne by printed paper, and it is better not to be read at all than to be read badly. Nietzsche confessed a similar aspiration to Franz Overbeck in his letter of February 84, when in his solitude in Nice, frightened by the rapid succession of his mental states and the progress of his thought, he asked himself whether I will not eventually become mute. At least a couple of times a day, I find myself agreeing with Napoleon, who said, "There are some things you don't write." Yet Nietzsche, as well as Plato, writes. He gives us the answer of this cardinal question of the Phaedrus in a short dialogue, once again in imitation of Plato's Phaedrus, the paragraph 93 of The Guy Science. "But why do you write?" Author: "I'm not one of those who think with an inky pen in their hand, much less one of those who in front of a pen inkwell abandon themselves to their passion while they sit in a chair and stare at the paper. I'm annoyed by and ashamed by, I am annoyed by and ashamed of my writing. Writing is for me a pressing and embarrassing need, and to speak of it even in a parable disgusts me." And the interlocutors ask, "But why then do you write?" Author: "Well, my friend, to be quite frank, so far, I have not discovered any other way of getting rid of my thoughts." Interlocutor: "And why do you want to get rid of them?" Author: "Why I want to? Do I want to? I must." And still, you have to write. Despite the proliferation of books and the legitimate prejudice against writing, we must remember why we write. You write because you have to, you write because your thoughts cannot remain confined to the cluster of your mind, but need to be expressed themselves and thereby communicate with others. And you cannot do this otherwise than by writing. In order to communicate with others, it is necessary to find a language that translates the mute and perfect language of one's own thought, in the best or at least the best possible way. One may legitimately ask at this point why Nietzsche, who went to school by the ancients, did not choose a different way of communicating his thought. Why, once again, writing and not, for example, speaking, discussing, dialoguing, as the Greeks themselves, like Socrates and Plato, made their knowledge alive and proliferating. Nietzsche was a university teacher for 10 years at the University of Basel, and as the accounts of his students tell us, he was an excellent teacher, an engaging and almost overwhelming speaker, capable of transmitting to his students that same passion for knowledge that animated him. It was precisely in the early years of Basel, when his enthusiasm for teaching was still intact, that Nietzsche developed the idea, or rather the project, not only of drawing inspiration from ancient education, but of restoring its form. Akroamatisch also wissen, akroamati, that means knowledge, was to be the motto of those years. This project for the reform of orally based, so achromatic education was to find its first and unfortunately last concrete expression in the conferences on the future of our educational institution, 1872. Contrary to what the title would suggest, there is a great misuse of Zukunftologie in the publicistic of those years, and Nietzsche is not immune to it. But at least from a formal point of view, we are not dealing with a simple manifesto or a reasoned program on the reform of schools and studies in Germany, what was very common at the time. Rather, these lectures were intended to be a first step in the implementation of an anachromatic educational reform. We are faced also with a mental experiment, although it was already conceived as a practical test, aimed at promoting a rebirth of philosophical dialogue in the clearest wake of Socrates and Plato, but also of the best Aristotle, according to Nietzsche, the one we do not have. The peripatetic, the achromatic Aristotle, the one who philosophizes while walking. In these lectures, the stylistic effort is so evident as to appear artificial. The multiple auditory references are evident. The sound suggestions, even the assonances and textual reference typical of poetry and rhetorical language. The narrative fiction that frames this lecture is a rather artificial attempt to recreate the presupposition of the Socratic dialogues. A teacher conversing with his friend pupil at nightfall, climbing up the hill from the Rhine Valley in the absence of a nearby Piraeus. And just as the Socratic dialogues became the narrative fiction par excellence, chosen as a framework for the dialectical exercises of the students of the Platonic Academy, so too Nietzsche's characters, the master and his pupils, enter into meta-literature. They are in fact spotted by a group of young people, understood here as potential future pupils, who, surprised and disturbed in their leisure activities by the arrival of this strange couple, begin to listen to them in silence, hidden by the dense wood. If these lectures were intended to constitute a rebirth of the true achromatic tradition, and not of its false duplicate, the German Vorlesung, described by Nietzsche as a talking mouth and many ears with alphas many writing hands. Few people, and among them probably even not Nietzsche, would have counted itself, would deny that we are faced with a failed experiment. This new form of peripatetic philosophy, this modern orobasia, is much less dynamic, not to say very anorgastic, than the ancient one. The master and his pupil sit in a clearing surrounded by trees, a kind of natural stage reminiscent of Wagner's early idealizing fantasies on an arboreal theater. Instead of a dialogue, we find ourselves in front of a very long monologue of the master, who does not even pretend to question, in the best dialectical tradition of the rhetorical question, the unprepared interlocutor, but is questioned by him. The interlocutor's role is therefore no other than to provide the pretext for the continuation of the monologue. The students, hidden in the think of the trees, disturbed in the middle of their legitimate amusement, these ones more properly Bacchic, these students are, as the master will define them, ideale Zuschauer. They are ideal because virtually it is as if they were not there. I quote, "They did not bother us. We thought we were alone." One only has to imagine this contrived monologizing dialogue en plein air, resounding at a reading, again, at the Vorlesen, from the podium of a Basler hall, and the picture of the failure of the revival of achromatic education in the context of a modern literary culture is complete. Regardless of what his opinion and aspiration were, Nietzsche never lost sight of one incontrovertible fact. The ancient oral tradition is lost to modern man. Lost because it is historically outdated, as it was already in Greece. Whether he considers this overcoming a form of decadence of Greek culture is not in question here. It is a fact that that particular system of communication and production of culture could not have survived longer or better than it did. And that much feared overcoming has finally happened. Whether it happened for physiological or historical reasons, reversing course is no longer possible or even desirable. Here too, Nietzsche's warning in the Gaia Science, we must overcome even the Greeks, shows its validity. More than the act of capitulation of the Greek Nietzsche, this appeal constitutes, in my opinion, the highest point reached by the philosopher in his understanding of antiquity and its critical value for the present. If the philosopher is to come to terms with the present, he will have to write. He will have to face all the risks of written communication in order to get his message across to his audience. And just as the ancient Greek had to develop a techne rhetoricae and ars rhetorica to optimize their performances in a world pervaded by speeches in which the success of an orator decided life and death, war or peace, and not least determine his wealth or his poverty, it will be necessary to apply oneself to developing an art of writing. I quote from Human All to Human, second part, the Wanderer 87, learning to write well. The age of speaking well is past because the age of the city culture is past. The extreme limit Aristotle allowed for the size of a city, that is, it must be possible for the herald to make himself audible to the whole assembled community, this limit is of as little concern to us as is the city community itself. We want to make ourselves understood, not merely beyond the city, but out over the nations. In his lectures on the history of Greek literature, Nietzsche stated more than once that the first and most important element to be considered in the composition of a work, whether a work of art or philosophical work, is the horizon of the public, of the audience. I quote from these lectures, every Greek genre has a corresponding audience. This does not mean that every great work of art has found its admirers. Rather, one could say if an audience is there, its corresponding work of art is also to be found nearby. Without Homer's audience, no Homer was possible. Without the Athenian city community, no Sophocles. End quotation. To understand a work of art, you have to first look at its audience. Look for the audience and you will find a corresponding work of art. Already in the Alexandrine period, the expansion of the boundaries of the Greek world had forced artists and scholars to abandon the expectation of a very specific audience of peers, the citizen of a single polis, in order to address the cultivated members of that extraordinary linguistic and cultural koine that unified the most distant provinces of the kingdoms of the diadoques. More than that, the modern writer today has to deal with a public with indefinite traits, non-homogeneous from a social, cultural, and political point of view, speaking different languages. Nietzsche's aspiration to be translated, especially into French, is well known. But above all, this public is living in distant places, and potentially, we must never forget this, even in distant times. I quote from Human All to Human 208, the book became almost human. Every writer is surprised and knew how once a book has detached himself from him, it goes on to live a life of its own. It is to him as thought a part of an insect had come free and was now going his own way. Perhaps he almost forgets it. Perhaps he raises himself above the views he has set down in it. Perhaps he, the author, no longer even understands it and has lost those wings upon which he flew when he thought out that book. During which time, the book, it seeks out its readers, and kindless life makes happy, terrifies, engenders new works, becomes the soul of new designs and undertakings. In short, the book lives like a being furnished with soul and spirit, and is yet not human. End quotation. The audience of a written work, although it may still aspire to a precise profile in the author's mind, is in fact no longer determined, and its concept expands to encompass anyone who can read wherever they are and whenever they get their hands on this book. These factors, which increase the reception capacity of a work, also multiply the difficulties of composition. The philosopher who wants to communicate himself will have to bend to an indistinct audience with changed features. Aphorism 87 of the Wanderer, learn to write well, continued as follows. I quote, "That is why everyone who is a good European now has to learn to write well and even better. This is still so, even if he happens to have been born in Germany, where writing badly is regarded as a national privilege. To write better, however, means at the same time also to think better, continually to invent things more worth communicating and to be able actually to communicate them, to become translatable into the language of one's neighbor, to make ourselves accessible to the understanding of those foreigners who learn our language, for example." End quotation. The major problem, compared to the same situation of an author in antiquity, is not so much the exponential broadening of this audience as its actual spiritual remoteness. A Greek from Pergamon and one from Antioch, a Jew from Alexandria and a Neoplatonist from Athens were much closer culturally than members of the same learned class of the bourgeoisie of the fragmented Germany were in Nietzsche's time. The philosopher and his audience, although they apparently dress alike, speak a similar language, and share the same customs, are no longer part of a common, all-pervasive culture. They do not recognize the same needs, the same aspiration. They do no longer speak, in short, the same language. As a critic of his time, and one of the most radical and less winking at common sense, there is no tradition that Nietzsche would like to share. He will therefore find himself having to create anew the possibility of an encounter with the public, constructing a new common ground ex nihilo. If there is one philosopher who did not make the task easy for himself when choosing the means of his communication, it was Nietzsche. We can rightly recognize among these models the French moralists such as Montaigne, La Bruyère, essayists such as Ralph Waldo Emerson and Thomas Carlyle. However, there will always be something that exceeds these models and which ultimately prevents us from framing Nietzsche within the ranks of a specific genre. For these two, or perhaps for this very reason, Nietzsche always had great difficulty in finding publishers. Until proven otherwise, then as well as nowadays, in order to find a publisher, you had to be able to demonstrate that you had an audience. Even a work such as Also sprach Zarathustra, which will in fact meet with extraordinary success and mark the cultural history of the new century, could not fail to appear and did not fail to appear to his contemporaries as alien, paradoxical, with unbearably messianic tones, and therefore as a potential editorial flop. This unwillingness to bend to the needs of a wide audience while still seeking readers, the determination not to be confused with the much denigrated journalist of the successful publication of his time, which he read indeed, may seem to be yet another confirmation of that elitism and haughtiness with which we still risk mistaking the ethical and epistemological position of Nietzsche's pathos of distance. We are not dealing here with an aristocratic rebel, or a contemptuous dandy with elitist poses. Nietzsche's choice is a pondered one, dictated by a precise awareness of the modes of communication. The difficulty Nietzsche encountered was that of the gap that the search for a common ground with his audience had to bridge. Since there is no starting point of equality between the philosopher and his audience, this gap can only be bridged in two ways: if the audience rises to the level of the philosopher, or if the philosopher lowers himself to the level of the audience. The latter option is ruled out in principle by Nietzsche, so the only option left is the former. It is pointless for the philosopher to learn to make his thought communicable and expressive, to learn to write well, if his audience cannot read. So, learning how to read. This shift of focus from the need to write well to the need to read well is a typical Nietzsche maneuver. It is one of those clever diversions that the philosopher presents to us on several occasions in his work. Just when we are ready to urge him on specific issues, when we must need to see him move into action, into that chimerical pars construens of his philosophy, the more the philosopher holds us back, forcing us to take a step backwards. The step backwards, the distancing of ourselves from the position we have laboriously acquired, is however the secret of Nietzschean criticism and the conditio sine qua non of any possible further progression of his thought. And here we are faced with one of those interesting steps back, which testify to a deepening and further radicalization of the critique. One of the most original aspects of the discussion on style in Nietzsche's work is how the philosopher very early on, and almost opportunistically, one might say, shifts the focus of attention from the author's need, and so including Nietzsche's need, to find a way towards a possible audience, bending his own style and the thought it conveys to the needs of the latter, and opts instead for a radical choice to educate an audience that is his own, making no concessions to it. The appeal to his audience to be understood, to be read well, will always be a priority for Nietzsche. Hat man mich verstanden, have I been understood, can be defined as the leitmotif of the retrospective gaze of Ecce Homo, for example. And as proof that nothing should be left to chance and that the philosopher Nietzsche, more than any other, is sovereignly aware of the means to achieve his goals, he uses a specific tool for educating his readers, his prefaces. As early as 1872, in the preface for Rede to the already quoted conferences on the future of our educational institution, Nietzsche wrote, I quote, "The reader from whom I expect something must have three qualities. He must be calm and read without haste. He must not always interpose himself in his education. And finally, he must not expect any result at the end. This book is intended for quiet readers, for people who are not yet caught up in the dizing haste of our rolling age and who do not yet feel an idolatrous pleasure in being crushed by its wheels. That is, this book is for few people. But these few cannot get used to estimating the value of everything according to the saving or wasting of time. These people still have time. Such a person, so my reader, has not yet forgotten how to think while he reads. He still knows how to read the secret between the lines. Indeed, he is of such a prodigal nature that he even still thinks about what he has read, perhaps long after he has put the book down." End quotation. This preface, already in the author's intention, does not limit its validity to his own work, which after all could already count of another introduction. Preface to be read before the lectures, although it does not actually refer to them, Nietzsche wrote in the incipit to these lectures. In fact, we might find in these instructions for the reader the valid formula for what Nietzsche will ask of his readers in the future. First of all, reading calmly and carefully, taking your time and not rushing to conclusions, anticipating them with your own preconceived ideas, nor expect the author to offer us in a short time, in the space of a book or even of a sentence, preconceived formulas, slogans, recipes for pre-cooked fruits. The author and the reader do the work together, and the most difficult task is precisely that of the reader. Already in this preface of 1872, the mention of the time, the appeal to give oneself time, is important with respect to a society of haste, speed, and immediate proliferation of ideas. What Nietzsche is complaining here is a cultural phenomenon, not an individual one. Every reader is in a hurry because modern society is in a hurry and educates its young people to intense and fast freedoms. 15 years after this illuminating preface, after the years of his richest and most important intellectual production, Nietzsche could not fail to note the failure of his communication strategy. This gave rise to the new prefaces project, which Nietzsche produced and published between 86 and 87 for the re-edition of his previous works. In this text, the philosopher takes distance from his path, which are a retrospective gaze that has often been reproached to him, but which I personally find illuminating. But above all, he settles account with his readers. Between the preface of 1872 and the new preface, for example, to Daybreak 1886, nothing seems to have changed. I quote from this preface: "A book, a problem such as this has no hurry. Besides both of us, I, just as much as my book, are friends of the lento. Having been a philologist is not for nothing. Perhaps you remain one, a teacher, in other words, of slow reading. In the long run, you end up writing slowly as well. Philology is namely that venerable art that required of its admirers one thing above all else, to go aside, to take time, to become still, become slow, as a goldsmith's art and connoisseurship of the word, which has nothing but fine, cautious work to take care of, and which achieves nothing if it does not achieve it lento. But for exactly this reason, philology is today more necessary than ever. By exactly this means, philology attracts and enchants us most powerfully in the midst of an age of work, that is to say, of precipitateness, of unseemly and sweeping over us, that wants at once to be over and done with everything, even with every old and new book. Philology itself is never so easily over and done with anything whatsoever. It teaches to read well, which means to read slowly, deeply, backward and forward, with care and respect, with reservation, with doors left open, with delicate finger and eyes. My passionate friends, and of the preface, this book decides for itself only consummate readers and philologists. Learn to read me well. End quotation. It was long, but quite important. We find here the same invitation to passionate reading, which takes time, as opposed to a hasty and superficial reading. An additional element of this preface is the reference to classical philology. On closer inspection, the art of reading well was already exists, has always existed, and bears a revealing name. The love for the speeches of the various Platonic philologists, the Theodoros and Laquete, they are Socrates called them philologos. Born in the age of the polis, when people still philosophize while walking and discussing, has long since been transformed into a love for the slow and careful reading of the written text. The mention of philology as the art of reading well is certainly not a new element in Nietzsche's work. He already introduced this in the lecture on the Encyclopedia for Classical Philology. It is interesting, however, to observe how, once again, untimelessness, unfashionability is reconfirmed as one of the philosopher's most valued critical tools. The figure of the philologist, this anachronistic scholar against whom Nietzsche had already exercised his critique in his notes for the unpublished unfashionable meditation We Philologists, now returns to the fore, like a paradoxical and anachronistic hero, a Don Quixote of slow reading in the age of speed and superficiality. The philologist, not least the philologist Nietzsche, is the only one in this modern age who still knows the value of slow, careful, and critical reading, who recognizes the pitfalls of a text, who knows how to go beyond the first degree of reading. And this leads to the paradox that ancient book, Greek and Latin authors, are nowadays perhaps the only ones that are still scrupulously read. Much more, the philologist as a good reader is also the last good teacher of our time. I quote from the unpublished On Time and Meditation via We Philologists. Philology is the art of learning and teaching to read in an age that reads too much. The philologist alone reads slowly and thinks about 6 lines for half an hour. Not his result, but this habit is his achievement. End quotation. One might wonder if nothing has really changed between the preface of the lectures of 72 and the new preface to Morgan Roth of 86. In all these years, Nietzsche was in no hurry. He waited for his reader and wrote his works confident that he would find him. He believed that nothing else was needed to educate his reader other than what was contained in his work. This is evident from the fact that for a long time he didn't want to write prefaces to his writings. But from 86 onwards, Nietzsche began to write prefaces in the form of warnings to the reader, vademecum and vadetecum, for those who wanted to make the journey through his work. In these prefaces, as well as in some significant passages in the work themselves, Nietzsche provides important stylistic indication. From his opera Omnia, which to an inattentive reader may appear as a single albeit fragmented discourse, the specificity and characters, the ethos of each individual works emerge. Thus, Daybreak is a book such as this is not for reading straight through on reading loud, but for cracking open, especially during a walk or on a journey. You must be able to stick your head into it and out again over and over and find about you nothing you are used to. On the contrary, okay, human or to human must be read aloud. One must make its language resonate, for it is, so Nietzsche, a musical book. Let me check if I can recover some other passage. Okay, not being in a hurry is therefore not only the virtue of the good reader, but also of the author. It does not matter if you are not read immediately. The important thing is not be read badly. The unwanted readers against which he claims in Human All Too Human. Hasty readers, clumsy readers, and the far more dangerous idiosyncratic readers. The reference to defend oneself against such readers, it might well seem legitimate to forget about the reader, to remove his image from before one's eyes. Writing only from oneself. This is the great temptation of every writer, when it is not just an opportunistic pose beyond which to hide one's ambition for success. Mihi ipsi scripsi is the motto chosen by Lou von Salome for the incipit of her book on Nietzsche. She considered Nietzsche a monologizing philosopher whose work was a memoir work. So someone who writes only for himself. So I don't agree with this position, even if Nietzsche states many times that he's writing only for himself, because he wants to avoid to think of an audience. To use the same terminology that Thomas Mann and Karol Kereni adopted for to spoke on another great stylist, Goethe, we are dealing, in the case of Nietzsche, with a great writer's entelechy. That means a great writer's soul. For a work such as Nietzsche's, a great soul is necessary, but a great soul is also a champion of magnanimous attitude. So a big soul is a magna anima, is someone who gives out a lot. It's therefore not out of selfishness that Nietzsche resolves to write for himself. More likely, however, he will have done so out of pride, not to diminish himself on his work. He cannot wait or expect his audience to welcome him with open arms as long as he keeps his claim high. But he certainly cannot give up these claims, without which his work will be ineffective, because it could not educate his reader. I quote from the Atlas of 81, keep on becoming who you are, the teacher and builder of yourself. You are not a writer, you write only for yourself. This is how you preserve the memory of your good moments and find their connection, the golden chain of yourself. This is how you prepare yourself for the time when you have to speak. Perhaps you will then be ashamed of speaking, as you have sometimes been ashamed of writing. That is still necessary to interpret yourself, that action and non-actions are not enough to communicate yourself. Yes, you want to communicate. I'm going really on the very last part. If I have 3-4 more minutes. See, let me ask what kind of readers could Nietzsche have in mind? The well-known adagium of Ecce Homo, einige werden posthum geboren, some are born posthumously, hides a much higher and deeper consideration than a simple and perhaps even bitter observation of the inadequacy of the readers. Of course, entrusting one's work to posterity, relying on posterity to understand one's work is a model found in the best and also worst literature of the time. But subtracting oneself from the heights of a Philistine present and writing for posterity may be nothing more than another form of writing for himself. But Nietzsche tells us more with his being born posthumously. This is not simply a matter of being born in the wrong era, of being ahead of times, of pioneering. Nietzsche states that his reader is not yet born, but cannot be born because it is his work that will create and educate him. This is why Nietzsche and his work are not merely and simply untimely, out of time, against the time, in advance on the times, but already resolutely posthumous. They are born to be understood when they are dead, only when they are dead, when the author and his work have been ruminated, metabolized, and definitely assimilated, becoming the flesh and blood of future readers. These readers Nietzsche has in mind seem to have very little in common with ordinary readers, if we consider reading to be an easy thing, a hobby, or even a means of acquiring knowledge. Reading for Nietzsche is something serious. It is sustained application, critical analysis, self-criticism, discipline, and overcoming difficulties. If writing is the way of communicating in a modern age, knowing how to read well, is the new sense that modernity will have to develop. The reader Nietzsche has in mind does not wear glasses and does not have a curved hump over books. He's such a heroic reader who will learn to look beyond the page, to look far and near into the future and into himself. I will read a very interesting fragment from 79, when Nietzsche has a sort of vision of this potential reader, and I will stop at this point. Here is a reader. He does not notice that I'm observing him. He's previously known to me, a shy fellow. It does not harm to be read by him, but he has been completely transformed, and I'm the one who has transformed him. Commas, question, exclamation marks, and the reader is supposed to give his body over to them completely and to show that what is moving also causes movement. There he is. He's completely transformed. Moral, we should learn to read well. We should teach to read well. The moral is we should not write for our readers. They think we should not be writing, where possible, for oneself. End quotation. If this is the reader Nietzsche has in mind when he writes, a reader transformed as a chorus of satyrs in the tragedy was also transformed, a reader whose transformation invests his mind, body, movement, well, this reader is very much like the superhuman, and the reading that produced him must have been a very effective training ground for thought. So, sorry for the delay. I was thinking I had more time. Thank you.